Before I start this video, if any academics are watching, think broadly. I am talking about critters that have been talked about publicly. Some have been brought up in presentations and talks that are posted online for everyone to see. I credit and refer to those who have talked publicly on this subject. I also include specimens that have been published on in the literature. I do fully understand the secrecy with which many folks talk about new specimens because of anything from rights issues to the want and need to publish on something you have found before someone comes in and takes over. However, this video is simply for science communication, and I will be more than happy to talk about these specimens again if they ever get names. However, many languish in collections because they are so fragmentary, or worse, they are lost in someone's private collection, so I don't see the harm in spreading awareness of them. In fact, there is a non-zero possibility it may bring good attention to you and your work. The horned dinosaurs, the group Ceratopsia, is a very broad group of dinosaurs with all sorts of sizes, horns, and frills. But they were not, shall I say, geographically blessed. Pretty much all of the big horn-headed ones were isolated in North America. There was a group of hornheads that split off the family tree very early on in their evolution. These guys didn't have horns at all. They barely had frills. These animals belonged to a group called the Neoceratopsia. There were also some early offshoot stragglers that are placed outside of this group, but are not part of the more advanced horns-and-frill-card-carrying-club. We can safely ignore these peons for the time being. The first evidence of ceratopsian dinosaurs were some measly teeth found during a geology survey expedition led by famed geologist Ferdinand van de Veer Hayden back in the mid-1800s. Unfortunately for the guys who found the teeth, experts at the time simply thought what they had on their hands was more of the same. The same here being the teeth of the hadrosaur Trachodon, which would go on to have its own hellish taxonomic history, resulting in Edmontosaurus. The next instance of ceratopsians in the annals of paleontologic history was the 1872 discovery of the infamous Agathaumas. Make sure you check out my video on this dubious dino for the full story. Agathaumas wouldn't be thought of as a horned dinosaur until the much more complete remains of Triceratops were found in the late 1880s. Two other ceratopsian dinosaurs were discovered in between Agathaumas and the clarification of what horned dinosaurs were, Polyonyx and Monoclonius, both of which are based on very fragmentary and indeterminate remains. Over the next 100 plus years, dozens of horned dinosaurs would be uncovered from Alaska to Mexico, even with a special weirdo in China. However, for every genus named, there are one or two more that remain unnamed or unnameable. These are the bits and pieces that indicate the presence of different types of horned dinosaurs in certain areas, but never quite provide enough information to get a good idea of true biodiversity. These are the critters that have been taken out of the field and that remain in practical stasis until such time as someone or a group of someones can actively take the time to fully prepare, ascension, and describe them. These are the mysterious ceratopsians that lurk within collections across America, or even in private hands. Let's see what the future may hold for ceratopsian science. The Aldama Centrosaur. The Aldama municipality of Chihuahua, Mexico is home to a layer of rock that has spewed out dinosaur fossils over the decades as it erodes. This formation doesn't have a name and is not fully described by anyone yet. However, it has been tentatively dated to the late Cretaceous, around 88 to 83 million years ago. Fossils from the area include large trees, tyrannosaurs, nodosaurs, hadrosaurs, and ceratopsians. It's not terribly different from the rock layers that contained Menephoceratops, Crichtonceratops, and Nasutoceratops. So it's ironic that the best fossils from this undetermined Aldama rock layer belong not just to a horned dinosaur, but a possible member of the Neoceratopsian group. At least 2 partial skeletons of these horned dinosaurs have been found at the Rancho Don Chuy locality, but are locked away from science in someone's private collection. Despite this loss, and according to paleoartist Louis V. Ray, it seems that the Museo del Mamut in Chihuahua has constructed a chimera of unrelated dinosaur fossils to represent a skeletal mount of the Aldama ceratopsian. And supposedly, the skull attached to this mount is a cast made from the privately held specimens, so it shows you what the noggin of the Aldama ceratopsian may look like. This explanation seems good enough because the skull is a very different color to the rest of the fossils used in the display, indicating that it is a cast made of resin. Based on the rather crushed and semi-fragmentary skull, this animal had a short round frill and broad brow horns like the rest of the Neoceratopsian dinosaurs. The size of the skull may indicate an animal around 2.5 meters in length, but that's beyond speculative. Bumpy round nose, CMN 8804. The early 1900s saw an explosion in ceratopsian research. After the Triceratops remains were found and showed paleontologists what the ceratopsians looked like, they started lumping previously found fossils into the group. They also began much more extensive dig sites, expeditions, and surveys across the American West to collect as many specimens as they could. Museums were being built and they needed stuff to show people. Charles Hazelius Sternberg, fossil collector and paleontologist, was probably one of the most well-known fossil getters for museums from the late 1800s till the 1930s. He had 3 sons that helped him in his industry, all of which went on to have fruitful careers in paleontology as well. One of his sons, Charles Mortram Sternberg, became most well known for his collection and descriptions of many of these staple Canadian dinosaurs, such as Pachy rhinosaurus, Brachylophosaurus, Parksasaurus, and Edmontonia. One of the things he collected was an unassuming set of skull bones from a horned dinosaur that would be offhandedly referred to an already named dinosaur before languishing in the collections of the Canadian Museum of Nature for nearly 80 years before getting a proper description. The skull, specimen CMN 8804, was collected by Sternberg back in 1937 after it was first found by field assistant Harold Lowe, eroding out of a layer of rock called the Oldman Formation in a part of southwestern Alberta that is now titled the Milk River Natural Area. Scrawled in his field notes, Sternberg simply labeled the specimen as belonging to Brachyceratops, a super dubious genus of horned dinosaurs based on exclusively immature material named 1914. The specimen consists of a good portion of the noggin, including a right lacrimal, the chunk of bone before the eye socket, a bit of the nasal bones, most of the non-beak part of the premaxilla, which is the front of the snout, both jugal bones, the part that makes up the cheekbones, the postorbitals, or the chunk of bone that makes up the back of the outer eye socket, the squamosal, the bottom and sides of the frill, and a parietal bone, which is the part that makes up the middle and top of the frill. CMN 8804 received proper description by Michael Ryan, Robert Holmes, Jordan Malone, Mark Lowen, and David Evans in a 2016 paper in the Canadian Journal of Earth Science. One of the main features of this skull that may have pointed Sternberg in the Brachyceratops direction is the lack of bony spines along the margin of the frill. Taking a look at the small chunk of frill that was preserved may have you questioning this identification, as I did when I first saw it. So, apparently, the scallops along the edge of the frill of CMN 8804 are part of the frill bone. The scallops that line the edge of all other adult ceratopsids are usually separate pieces of osteoderm-like bones called epoccipitals. Baby centrosaurs had bony projections from the edge. then gained the actual individual epoccipital bones as they aged. As the ceratopsians got much older, particularly in chasmosaurs like Triceratops and Torosaurs, those bits of pointy bones rounded out and began fusing to the frill. The lack of epoccipital bones is one of the main features of CMN 8804 that the paper used as a focal point to designate a new group of horned dinosaurs, the Neoceratopsians. This is because the weird bony scallops are present in the known material of the dubious Avaceratops. Plus, CMN 8804 had a single scallop in the middle of the frill, just like how Neoceratopsia has one epoccipital bone in the middle of its frill atop the scalloped bone. The combination of these features are generally not present in any of the other Centrosaurs. Therefore, they are all each other's closest relatives. The authors noted that they were unsure if the bony scallops are homologous to the epoccipitals of other Centrosaurs. Homologous is an evolutionary biology term that describes two distinct lineages having the same trait because it was present in their common ancestor. So, in this case, if the two types of bony bumps are homologous, that means the common ancestor of the Neoceratopsians and the rest of the Centrosaurs started out with bumps, with the rest of the Centrosaurs evolving bony caps on top of the bumps that eventually evolve into the giant spikes of critters like Styracosaurus and Stellosaurus. On top of all this, CMN 8804 seems to have been a late juvenile or early young adult when it died. The skull itself seems to have been roughly similar to the size of the noggin in Neoceratopsia, a specimen considered to have been an adult when it died. However, the Neoceratopsia specimen also has epoccipital bones on its frill bumps, unlike CMN 8804. So, is it an adult or juvenile? Well, the authors found a bone texture seen in adult ceratopsians on some parts of the CMN 8804 skull, so it had a mix of juvenile and adult features, making it an in-between life stage. Considering the fragmentary nature of named critters like Crichtondenceratops and Menepheceratops, I wouldn't be too surprised if someone tries to justify naming CMN 88004 at some point. The One Piece, CPC 279. Not a lot of folks in the US think about Mexican paleontology, but the country is littered with all sorts of unique prehistoric animals. Mesozoic Mexico was quite a happening place. One of the more productive layers of rock in Mexico has been the Cerro del Pueblo Formation, which has produced the ornithopods Latyrhinus, Critosaurus, Velafrons, and Tlatolophus, the named Mexican chasmosaur Gohuilaceratops, plus the only North American dinocheirid Paracenosaurus. Some of these finds, plus some intriguing and mysterious horned dinosaurs, are the result of a wonderful collab from 2002 to 2003 between the Utah Museum of Natural History, Royal Tyrrell Museum of Paleontology, and Museo del Desierto, named the Horned Basin Dinosaur Project. In this video, I will briefly touch on one of the ceratopsian fragments this project found. In part 2 of this mini-series, I will touch on the other. A right squamosal bone, the bottom side of the frill in horned dinosaurs, was uncovered from a dig site in the Horned Basin near the town of Rincon, Colorado, west of Saltillo, Coahuila, Mexico. It was taken out of the middle portion of the Cerro del Pueblo Formation, which dates to the Campanian age of the Cretaceous period, about 72 million years ago. This unassuming chunk of frill is thought to belong to the centrosaur part of the ceratopsian tree, due to the shape of the border and the anatomy of the edge that connects this chunk of frill to the chunk that sits in the middle. Without more material, that is unfortunately it. A massive, horny undertaking, Kyaro Basin Project. Like I've been saying this entire video, museums and colleges and stuff like that have been doing all sorts of huge projects since forever. It helps produce a bunch of science papers and build careers. It helps humanity broaden their understanding of life of the past, and it has the added benefit of providing museums with stuff to show people. Another one of these was the Kyaro Basin project, started sometime between 2000 and 2001 between the Natural History Museum of Utah, the University of Utah, the Utah Geological Survey, and the Bureau of Land Management. Like most past projects, this one has to survey the formations of interest, collect anything at the surface, and document where more substantial stuff was, all to get a better picture of late Cretaceous life from Utah. The project explored the Kyarowitz, Wawweep, and Straight Cliffs formations, and has successfully found well over a dozen new dinosaurs from many known groups. Among them are a bunch of horned dinosaur fossils. Some have been given names: Neoceratopsia, Cosmoceratops, Utaceratops, Diabloceratops, and Machyroceratops, but a handful have never been named due to their very fragmentary nature, but definitely represent different genera or species to those already named. Many are also in the process of being fully described and receiving names. Let's have a gander at these bits. Kyarowitz Centrosaur A, not a mystery. Kyarowitz Centrosaur A has already been described and named. It's Neoceratopsia. I only bring it up because 3 specimens were lumped into the genus. The holotype specimen, which is the noggin and some parts of the front of the body, plus 2 more skull specimens. One was UMNH VP 19466, and the other was UMNH VP 19469. We're here because of this 3rd specimen. UMNH VP 19469 is a squamosal bone, the bottom and side of the frill. In the 2013 book, At the Top of the Grand Staircase, a bunch of paleontologists published a paper that did an overview of a bunch of the ceratopsian fossils found throughout the Kyarowitz Basin project. And within this tome, the UMNH VP 19469 specimen is thought of as probably belonging to the Kyarowitz Centrosaur A, or now Neoceratopsia. It would go on to be used in the official description of Neoceratopsia. I mention it here because there is a small possibility that it actually belongs to another unique, very close relative of Neoceratopsia. This is because it's a single fragmentary piece of frill, but also because it's from a slightly different chunk of rock than the other fossils used to name Neoceratopsia. It comes from the lower bit of the middle of the Kyarowitz formation. The rest of the specimens were found above this point. The anatomical traits preserved in the isolated frill piece do suggest it is very similar, if not the same as Neoceratopsia. But, you know, there remains the possibility it is something different. Kyarowitz Centrosaur B, UMNH VP 20949. Next up in the lineup is Kyarowitz Centrosaur B, specimen UMNH VP 20949, which was found in the middle bit of the Kyarowitz formation and is just a frill. It's unusual for having the proportionally smallest frill holes of any known centrosaur. The shape of the frill is somewhat similar to Neoceratopsia, and it comes from the same layer of rock. The size of the frill is not horribly different than that of Neoceratopsia, and it also has a similarly boring frill edge with simple bumpy epiparietal bones. That being said, the authors note it doesn't have enough diagnostic traits preserved for them to name it or describe it further. Only more remains of this mysterious ceratopsian will allow a better picture of it. Wawweep Centrosaur A, or Pilot Knoll Centrosaur, UMNH VP 20600. Now that we've covered every mysterious centrosaur from the Kyarowitz formation, we can now move on to the other formation that the Kyarowitz Basin project explored, the Wawweep formation, which dates to the middle and late Campanian age of the Cretaceous period, so about 81 to 77 million years ago. The oldest of the Centrosaurs found by the project is this wavy chunk of frill from the Pilot Knoll locality that was eroding out of the lowest sandstone member of the Waweep, specimen UMNH VP 20600. When the specimen was briefly described in a 2013 paper on Utah ceratopsians, it didn't seem to have enough information to describe and name, but it did have enough to know that it's different from the next youngest horned dinosaur, Diabloceratops, which comes from the layer right above it. The only frill decorations preserved are the pair of sideways curving hooks at the top of the frill, which are most like those found in Avaceratops from Canada. According to paleontology student Savannah Carpenter's 2021 presentation on all the ceratopsians from Utah, this specimen will be getting a name and therefore description at some point. She also said that a jawbone was found with the frill. Waweep Centrosaur C, or Death Ridge Centrosaur, UMNH VP 9549. Waweep Centrosaur B would end up being Diabloceratops, so we skip on over to Waweep Centrosaur C. Waweep Centrosaur C, the Death Ridge Centrosaur, or specimen UMNH VP 9549, was uncovered from the top of the Waweep Formation back in 2000, technically making it the first horned dinosaur found by the crew of the Kyaro Basin project. This specimen is composed of this very fragmentary chunk of parietal frill and some apparent bones from the body, the postcrania. But these fossils remain unfigured in the Lowen and colleagues paper from 2013, so nothing can be said of them. The frill has none of the epiparietal bones attached to the frill, but apparently the raised, scalloped, bony bumps where they attach preserved some scarring, which means the frill would most likely have had those bones attached to it when the animal was alive. Since they are not preserved, it's safe to assume they fell off the frill after death, which might mean the animal was not super old when it died. The older a ceratopsian seems to get, the more fused the epiparietal bones seem to get to the frill. This frill differs a little from the rest in having potentially bigger and taller bones on the frill, but considering how bad the specimen is, all of that is speculative. The paper that briefly describes this frill states that they think it may have had really big spikes like those in Styracosaurus, Rubeosaurus, and Stellosaurus, but as I said before, this is extremely speculative and was just a stray hypothetical, or of an indication of what else may be lurking in the Waweep Formation. According to paleontology student Savannah Carpenter's 2021 presentation on all the ceratopsians from Utah, this specimen will also be getting a name and thorough description at some point. Diabloceratops, UMNH VP 16704. Before we move away from the Kyaro Basin project, I wanted to take a look at an anomalous specimen that has been questioned by some researchers, the nipple butte skull. This skull was used to help describe Diabloceratops in 2010 by Don DeBlue and Jim Kirkland. For the full story, make sure to watch my video on Diabloceratops with a link in the description and comment section below. In short, the noggin, specimen UMNH VP 16704, was initially discovered in 1998 by Joshua A. Smith from a locality called Nipple Butte, as it was eroding out of the top of the lower chunk of the Waweep Formation. The specimen was finally collected in 2000, but was not described until 2010, when DeBlue and Kirkland found enough anatomical traits in this specimen to link it very closely to the then more recently discovered holotype specimen of Diabloceratops. All told, this other Diabloceratops specimen consists of skull bits, mostly a chunk of the frill, plus the palate, a bit of the upper jaw, the right cheekbone, part of the right eye socket, the brain case, and the bones surrounding it. DeBlue and Kirkland noted that the bone texture in this specimen indicates that it was old at the time of death, being even older than the Diabloceratops holotype skull, which was skeletally mature. The major difference between the holotype and human HVP16704 is the shape of the edge of the bottom portion of the frill, a bone called the squamosal. In human HVP16704, the squamosal is fan-shaped, while it's more rectangular in Diabloceratops. This has indicated to a few researchers that this specimen belongs to something that isn't exactly Diabloceratops eateni. However, to give the Diabloceratops authors some credit, Don DeBlue and Jim Kirkland were well aware of this in their publication of the devil-horned face. They label the second specimen as CF Diabloceratops sp, which means it may or may not belong to the Diabloceratops genus. This could mean that it is a separate species of Diabloceratops, a weird individual, or a completely different but still very closely related genus. Mark Lowen and colleagues write in their 2013 paper on Kyaro Basin ceratopsians that this specimen seems to have some features found more in advanced Centrosaurs than something like Diabloceratops, which was the earliest offshoot of the Centrosaurs along with Ceratopsia. Lowen and friends say that the fan-shaped frill plus the restricted condition of the otic notch places UMNH VP16704 among the more advanced Centrosaurs. So it might represent something completely unique among early Wawweep horned dinosaurs. Killing Avaceratops. USNM 4802, USNM 2415, and more 692. The dinosaur known as Avaceratops has a long, fraught paleontologic history with all sorts of issues. This is all thanks to Peter Dodson naming the animal using a juvenile skeleton by the designation of ANSP 15800. It really sucks that this specimen is a really good one, preserving much of the skeleton and good chunks of the skull. The issue really is that the animal is too young to use any of its anatomical features for evolutionary data. Its history then becomes more complicated by the addition of 2 frill pieces to the genus in 1993, a bigger skull in 1999, and then a very complete skeleton found by Treebold Paleo Inc. As it happens, pretty much the only thing that can be referred to the genus and species is that original holotype specimen, but it remains hard to use because of the aforementioned age of the individual. The recent Treebold Paleo specimen would go on to be named Ceratopsia. The other 3 specimens are their own unique critters, but are too fragmentary to be named. Most evolutionary analyses of horned dinosaurs exclude all Avaceratops material, though some have used more 692 over any other material, since it has a lot of good skull bits. The first remains to be lumped into Avaceratops are USNM 4802 and USNM 2415, both of which are the bottom/side bones of the frill, bones called squamosals. These specimens have historical value. In his 1996 book, The Horned Dinosaurs, paleontologist Peter Dodson writes of his then student Paul Pinkulski finding and reanalyzing a pair of squamosals, specimens USNM 4802 and USNM 2415 that were collected by famed paleontologist and fossil hunter John Bell Hatcher in the late 1880s. They were then figured in a 1907 monograph that was started by Othniel Charles Marsh, then picked up by Hatcher after he died, and then picked up by another paleontologist, Richard Swan Lowell, after he died, in which this procession of paleontologists provisionally placed these specimens in the Ceratops genus. Hall observed that these specimens shared a lot more in common with the then semi-recently described Avaceratops, having a straight border near the top of the specimen where it would connect with the other bones of the frill, and a series of 3 bumps on the surface. These are features that were then only seen in the only known specimen of Avaceratops. The 3 bumps are a feature now seen mostly only in the short-nosed Neoceratopsians, which is why all specimens that have been referred to Avaceratops have found themselves to be closely related to the long-horned Neoceratopsia. Then came a 1999 paper by Penkulski and Dodson that redescribes the holotype specimen of Avaceratops, ANSP 15800, plus the frill bits I just mentioned, as well as the then newly found MOR 692, which is an entire skull that's only missing the beak and nose, the tip of the jaw bones, and the bones that connect the frill to the skull. For some backstory, MOR 692 was found in 1991 in rocks of the Judith River Formation, about 125 kilometers away from the location of the Avaceratops holotype, ANSP 15800. It's much larger than the holotype skull and came from an older individual. To be fair to these scientists, they made sure to write in their paper they were tentatively assigning the skull to the Avaceratops genus. They weren't sure it definitely was Avaceratops because it has features that make it a little different, but this didn't stop others from using it as a stand-in for the genus. Over the several decades since this publication, though, enough has been said about the various Avaceratops specimens that the most parsimonious and consensus assumption here is that the 3 extra Avaceratops specimens all represent their own unique Centrosaurs that will likely never get a name unless much better remains are found to be identical or near identical. This also means that there were likely many types of Neoceratopsians throughout the late Cretaceous of Canada. Tarantula Mesa Centrosaur. The next Centrosaur on the list is probably the most mysterious. No images of its fossils have ever made their way online, and it has only been mentioned by paleontology student Savannah Carpenter in her 2021 presentation on Utah ceratopsians. As she states, the critter was recovered from the beds of the Tarantula Mesa sandstone, which is a layer of rock that is very slightly older than the Kyparoids Formation. Carpenter says the animal seems to share a lot of traits with Neoceratopsia, but had a lot more epiparietal bones along the frill and much longer brow horns, supposedly the longest of any known Centrosaur. It will be very interesting to see what this animal looks like, what name it gets, and where it places in the family tree once it gets published. Thick Nose Nose, TMP 2002.76.1. Among the largest and most famous of the horned dinosaurs was one that didn't even have any on its face, Pachy. This boss-nosed beast has been known to science since the 50s, and in the 70-plus years since the description of the first material, 2 additional species have been named, with a few more possibly existing. Dozens of Pachyrainosaurus specimens now exist, from babies to elders. One specimen still remains enigmatic as to its true identity. All the way back in 1996, world-renowned paleontologist Phil Currie and friends were taken out to a spot of land in Dinosaur Provincial Park to inspect a fossil find made by local rancher Gene Johnson. The team, having been convinced they had a big ol' horned dinosaur carcass on their hands, brought in the cavalry by the year 2000, and excavation of the specimen would be ongoing until 2006. The critter would take another year to be fully prepared by workers at the Royal Tyrrell Museum. All told, the critter, designated specimen TMP 2002.76.1, is basically most of the skeleton, with some neck, back, hips, and tail vertebrae, bits of the pelvis and shoulder girdle, most of the hind limbs, and good portions of the forelimbs, as well as a skull missing only some of the more important bits of the frill. The specimen would be described in 2010 by Michael Ryan, David Eberth, Donald Brinkman, Phil Currie, and Darren Tank. This author team conducted a phylogenetic analysis by quantifying all of the traits preserved in the bones and then comparing those traits to the traits of a bunch of other known Centrosaurian horned dinosaurs in the computer. This analysis found that this horned dinosaur was most closely related to the Pachyrhinosaurus genus, with the team tentatively lumping the critter into the Pachyrhinosaurus genus, but it was different enough to place outside and basal to the then 2 officially named species, Pachyrhinosaurus canadensis and lacustai. Pachyrhinosaurus heroterum would be named in 2013 on different fossils. The frill and the bony decorations that lined the frill are the most important horned dinosaur features when it comes to identifying new genera and species and telling them all apart from one another. This is because this feature was the most genetically plastic. Boiling that down a bit more, it seems that it was this part of these animals that changed the fastest and most often as new species evolved. So, that means it can be tracked and used to split apart different specimens as different species or genera, especially when combined with a bunch of other possible data. So, for TMP 2002.76.1, the consensus is that this thing is most likely a unique species of Pachyrhinosaurus, but the lack of frill makes it hard to be confident one way or the other. Until some more specimens are found that match the rest of this poor guy's bones to a T. Fourth time's a charm, UALVP 53300. There are a ton of Pachyrhinosaurus specimens. It's easily one of the most common ceratopsians ever found, along with Triceratops, Centrosaurs, and others. This is always bound to produce some back and forth on what might count as a species or genus, especially considering they're all long-dead fossils with no genetic data to speak of. This led paleontologist Elizabeth Crook to make her 2015 master's thesis on the nasal bones of Pachyrhinosaurus, leading her to name a new species, Pachyrhinosaurus youngi. A few specimens of a Pachyrhinosaur were discovered in the Wapiti River bone bed, which is in the Wapiti Formation between 2007 and 2014. These specimens include a skull missing the frill, a frill horn, a chunk of frill and horn, and a skull missing the snout and frill. Not particularly great for identifying it as a new species, but since at least some bits of frill are preserved and can be somewhat reasonably assumed to come from the same species as the more complete skulls, as they are all from the same dig site, it's not the worst collection of bones for phylogenetic analysis. When Crook got all her anatomical data from her specimens and put them against the data of other known Centrosaurians, she found that her proposed Pachyrhinosaurus youngi formed a polytomy with Pachyrhinosaurus canadensis and Peroterum, but that Pachyrhinosaurus lacustai split off earlier from this group. And the TMP 2002.76.1 specimen was basal to all of this, having split off the group right after Ankylosaurus. Keep in mind that polytomy is the word used to describe an evolutionary concept of an unnatural grouping of species or genera in which they all split from one point, rather than show true speciation or branching as in more natural groupings. A soft polytomy would be one that exists only as a way to organize critters and will be resolved as more paleontologic data is uncovered. A hard polytomy is one informed by genetic data and really represents a divergence event of 3 or more groups of animals. Anyway, this proposed Pachyrhinosaurus youngi is provisional and seems not to have seen a ton of support among most paleontologists. So I guess wait and see how the species turns out. A monster big nose. You thought we were done with Pachyrhinosaurs. Ha! Wrong. So, according to 2 news reports from 2014, paleontologist Darla Zelenitsky and colleagues uncovered another weird Pachyrhinosaur in 2013. This time it was a skull larger than any other known from Alberta. They revealed the specimen at the University of Calgary, and they think it's possible that the specimen represents another new species. This skull is about 75 to 80% complete. None of the news reports ever say how big it is, but from the images provided, it's probably about 6 feet long. According to the news reports, Zelenitsky said she intended to return to the dig site in 2014 to look for more of this animal, but since news of this was never made, I think it's safe to assume not much else was ever found. Since not much has ever been said of this thing, there isn't much for me to say about it either. Monster Mystery of 130 Years, AMNH FR 3999. Centrosaurus is a 120-year-old genus of horned dinosaur that usually appears with a big nose horn, small brow horns, and a relatively unadorned small round frill, except for 2 pairs of horns at the apex of the frill halves. One bends down over the frill and one bends up above it. To make a very long story short, a ton of different horned dinosaur specimens found since the late 1800s, plus those that would be named Centrosaurs, would be jumbled together, split apart, and relabeled countless times until like maybe the 1990s. The first issue started with Agathomys, which is most likely a chasmosaurian and most likely an example of Triceratops or Torosaurus. Then came another set of fossils from the Denver Formation of Colorado that got named Polyonyx. Finally is the genus Edward Drinker Cope named Monoclonius, which has held on longer than the others I just mentioned. This genus collected species names like they were selling out: Crassus, Recurvicornis, Sphenocircus, Physis, Loi, Belli, Canadensis, Dawsoni, Flexus, Cutleri, Nessicornis, Montanensis, Longirostris, Apertus, Albertensis, and Lamerzi. Most of these turned out to be specimens that belong to already named genera, others are indeterminate. The only specimens that can be kept as real Monoclonius is the lectotype, this frill, so this may or may not be valid. Moving on, once Cope realized his Monoclonius was a horned dinosaur along with Agathomys and Triceratops, he reinterpreted his fossils and then named a few new species of Monoclonius based on some other fossils he had. One of those was this lovely fossil, specimen AMNH FR 3999, a pair of brows, nose horn, and a small bit of frill. Cope named this critter Monoclonius recurvicornis, and it remained this way until the 1990s when paleontologists came back to Monoclonius to try and figure out the mess. Much more recently, work has been underway to figure this specimen as well as a bunch of newly found, nearly identical specimens from a Judith River bone bed as its own genus and species apart from Monoclonius. Others. There have apparently been some old reports by the Los Angeles County Museum of ceratopsian fossils from the El Gallo Formation of Baja California. A 1996 paper also noted reports of ceratopsians from the Cabollona group in Sonora, Mexico. None of these are as well studied as everything else I talked about in this video. There is at least one other possible centrosaur from Malta, Montana that I have omitted from this list because it's being directly worked on for publication in the near future. Plus, there wasn't any publicly available information on it anyway. I won't tell you which one it is, but be excited for a new ceratopsian. And that pretty much is every centrosaurian dinosaur that is both known to the public and yet to be named. Everything I have discussed is stuff that has been publicly talked about in presentations, papers, and on social media. In fact, even photos and art of these enigmatic, undescribed beasts has been widely shared. I totally get not talking about things that have just been freshly found, or that have weird rights issues, because there could be real academic or legal repercussions, but that's clearly not what I've done here. I would like to thank Prehistoric Wiki for sharing many of these dinosaurs. This is where I started. The literature took me the rest of the way. Now, who's ready for a part 2? Chasmosaurs. For more interesting stories about nature, the history of life, or what goes bump in the night, subscribe, like this video, drop a comment in the comment section below, and hit the bell icon to stay in the know with everything Edge. Thanks for watching.